Hi, my name is Scott Ditchy. I first want to thank you all for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm in sunny St. Pete, Florida, where I live, but it's probably a little bit warmer than where you guys are up there. What a very cool event, and I'm very excited to be here talking to you a little bit about the history of organized crime in the Atlantic Highlands, Greater Monmouth County, and some little anecdotes about that. Um, First off, I want to start again. My name is Scott Deitche. I've written 7 books on organized crime. I run a mafia walking tour of Ybor City, which is a historic neighborhood in Tampa. And anytime I'm interviewed, anytime anyone talks with me about organized crime or where I got my interest in organized crime, I have a stock answer whenever they ask, "Hey, how did you get interested in the mob?" Well, I grew up in New Jersey. So right then and there, you know that you're surrounded by a lot of this stuff. And I was born in Perth Amboy. I grew up in Fords, lived there up until the mid '90s when I moved to Florida for a job, and have been here ever since. But definitely a Jersey boy at heart, and spent quite a bit of time at the Atlantic Highlands on the fishing boats out of the harbor. Definitely familiar with Sandy Hook, Kingsburg, the whole area around the Highlands. So a huge part of my childhood and formative years for sure. When we talk about organized crime in New Jersey, there's just a huge breadth of topics, of figures, of places, of things. But in concentrating more on the Atlantic Highlands area, really, it was really a hotbed. I would say probably one of the 5 busiest ports of entry during Prohibition for illegal alcohol being smuggled into the state of New Jersey. And um, I think people now don't realize how abundant the trade in illicit alcohol was, and really how the Atlantic Highlands was such an important part of that history. So, kind of taking a step back, when the Volstead Act came into effect in 1920 and Prohibition started, almost immediately you had a flurry of bootlegging activity, not only of making your own having your own distillery operations, but really smuggling of alcohol from overseas. So you had a few different ports of entry into the United States. Most of the alcohol being brought in was either from Canada or from Europe. Now, when you get down into the Gulf Coast area of Florida, where I am now, that was primarily rum, corn sugar, and molasses that were being brought in from Cuba. But in New Jersey, you had primarily Canadian whiskey, brandy, and liqueurs. You also had scotch and other liqueurs coming over from Europe. And these were bought on larger supply ships that oftentimes would dock 12 miles offshore. And the reason they picked 12 miles offshore is because that was international waters. That was where the Coast Guard had difficulty getting to them because it wasn't under their jurisdiction. So you have these ships that are docked 12 miles offshore, just out of range of where the Coast Guard can get to them. How do you get the liquor from there to the ports, to whether it's Atlantic City, whether it's the Atlantic Highlands or Perth Amboy or one of these other areas? Well, you had a system of speedboats called Jersey skiffs, and they still raced them at the Jersey shore, and they were specially designed to not only effectively and quickly get alcohol from these ships offshore, but more importantly, they were designed to outrun the fleet that the Coast Guard had at that time. So these small little skiffs would race out of these ports, they would unload the liquor off the larger ships and race back into port. And it was a pretty well organized operation. So you had guys that were commercial fishermen or clammers that in their off time or even to supplement their income would become rum runners, and they would go become these couriers for these ships that were bringing in illegal alcohol. Now, there were some smugglers that were pretty well known at the time, and probably one of the biggest was a guy named William McCoy. And legend has it that that's where the kind of the turn of phrase "the real McCoy" comes from the adventures of William McCoy. And he was a smuggler up and down the East Coast, but very well known in New Jersey and New York. He brought in a lot of the illegal booze that was coming into the state and into the region. And I'm going to turn over to my notes here for a second because I want to read a. He became almost like a folk hero that a lot of these Prohibition era gangsters kind of had that, whether it was Al Capone, but But William McCoy really kind of became a folk hero. And I want to read you a description of him that was published in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in the 1920s. This is kind of funny because, when you think about like a newspaper now talking about a criminal this way, his bearing is regal and assured. He has the manner of a man born tall, strong body, and a muscular, good-humored face. His skin has been tanned to the color of leather by tropical sun and wind. His eyes are keen and intelligent. White wrinkles at the corners indicate that they have looked for a long time across wide waters and laughed. And another newspaper, a Jersey-based one, called him handsome, glamorous, soft-spoken, well-educated, essential for any self-respecting rum runner. He was perfectly manicured. So it's, he became this kind of folk hero, and he was eventually arrested by the Coast Guard after a long chase off the coast of South Jersey. But getting back to the Atlantic Highlands, in the 1920s, when the booze was being brought into these ports like the Highlands, they were being shipped to other areas as well, and there were these trucking smuggling routes that primarily went up to Newark, Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. And in fact, some of the main rum runners and bootleggers were in partnership with a couple brothers that we're going to be talking about in a second that operated strictly out of the Highlands. Out of Newark, you had Abner Longy Zwillman, who was a Jewish mob figure and became probably one of the most well-known mob figures around that time. And he ran a very large bootlegging operation out of Newark. Richie the Boot Boyardo out of Newark as well. You had King Charles Solomon out of Boston. Out of New York City, you had the usual suspects, the Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and those guys. You had Waxy Gordon out of Philadelphia. So you had a lot of these people that became household names, certainly at least in New Jersey and through New Jersey media. But in the Atlantic Highlands, the real true powerhouses at the time were two brothers, Al and William Lillian. And they were kind of the beer barons, the bootleg kingpins of the Atlantic Highlands. And they operated out of a house in Middletown, the old Oscar Hammerstein mansion in Middletown on Chapel Hill Road. And that was their headquarters. And what was interesting about it is in 1929, federal agents staged a massive raid at a number of locations, both on the Jersey Shore in Monmouth County and up in Newark. And when they raided the mansion that the Lillian brothers were stationed out of, that was their headquarters, they found not only money and all this other stuff that would indicate, a large legal operation was going on there, but it was a radio station. They actually had radio equipment that they would use to connect with the ships that were docked offshore. And it was the hub, this like telecommunications hub for this massive, massive bootlegging operation. Now, both the brothers were indicted by a grand jury, but Al Lillian, who was really kind of a little bit more the kingpin than his brother William, he was acquitted in 1931. But while the Lillians were running these operations, there were also other gangsters, local bootleggers that wanted a bigger piece or fell out of favor with the Lillians. So you actually had not only some gunfights down at the port area, the waterfront of the Atlantic Highlands, but a couple murders as well that were attributed to the Lillians. A couple guys that were found in a burlap sack in Brooklyn were business partners of the Lillians. So not only were they the kind of that romantic bootlegger thing, but they were engaged in a lot of other illicit activity, including murder. There's a newspaper account of a shootout down in the Atlantic Highlands that between police and bootleggers. So this was pretty commonplace throughout the 1920s. And because of that, the Lillians became kind of, I don't want to say local legends, but certainly anytime anything happened, newspapers from up and down the coast would be writing about their exploits. Now, a little bit of a change happened, and let me just talk about this, was in September of 1923, when a gang of hijackers out of Newark attempted to hijack some of the trucks that were unloading or that were loading the booze that were coming off the Jersey skiffs off the coast of the Atlantic Highlands. this huge gun battle erupted, and this really started a long-term kind of tumult in the underworld that reached throughout all areas of New Jersey. So this was also a very violent time in the Atlantic Highlands for this particular industry. And after Prohibition ended, some of that rancor still existed. In fact, in 1933, within 1 month, Charles Solomon, the Lillian's business partner, was killed in Boston. And then in October of 1933, when a couple friends came to the Hammerstein mansion in Atlantic Highlands, they found Al Lillian shot in the back of the head. And it was definitely a mob-related killing. There was a pair of pallbearer gloves and an upturned ace of spades card on a table in the main dining room. And it was supposedly it was to send a message to him. There's a lot of theories as to why Lillian was killed. Some of it had to do with the killing of Solomon in Boston. Some people thought that he was illegally stealing money from some of the other illegal operations he owned, or he was engaged in. I'm sorry. But it's still an unsolved murder. And even though they arrested a bunch of people, a couple of people got indicted, it's still not clear who killed Al Lillian. But it's definitely one of the probably more well-known grislier killings in the Atlantic Highlands, Middletown area. Now, following Prohibition, when things started changing, you didn't have the bootlegging, you didn't have the rum running anymore. A lot of mafia figures went into other rackets. Illegal gambling was probably the biggest. And when illegal gambling took over, the underworld itself started changing too. And you know, when you talk about the mob, you kind of talk about a wide variety of ethnic organized criminals, especially during Prohibition. But the mafia, which is a Sicilian organization, came to dominate organized crime post-Prohibition era, and they became the dominant organized crime group. And it's kind of an all-encompassing thing when you talk about the mob or the gangsters. Definitely in that post-Prohibition to modern era, you're talking about Sicilian mafioso or the mafia. And the mafia were very active, obviously, in the New York City and New Jersey area, and also Monmouth County. Monmouth County became both a bedroom community for mafioso, but also a place where they were pretty active. Illegal gambling became very commonplace in a lot of taverns, a lot of bars throughout Monmouth County. The town of Red Bank was a hotbed of illegal gambling activity. In fact, there was some indications that some of the police were on the take in Red Bank in the 1950s that were protecting some of the illegal gambling operations. You have indications of gambling operations in the Atlantic Highlands and Keyport down to Seabright. But probably the biggest town that had mafia connotations, especially from the 1950s and through the 1960s, was Long Branch. And Long Branch was under the control of a gangster called Anthony Russo, better known as Little Pussy Russo. It was probably the inspiration for Big Pussy in The Sopranos. But Russo was a mobster in one of the New York Five families, and he not only kind of controlled illegal activity in the Long Branch and the immediate area, but he also had a lot of ins with politicians in the town. So there was corruption all the way up through the police department and through the city council, and because of that, he was considered one of the top mafioso in the state of New Jersey. Now, he did, as I mentioned, he was part of one of the five families of New York. And the head of one of those five families was a guy named Vito Genovese. Now, Vito Genovese rose to power in the early 1930s and became head of a family which eventually bore his name. And he was definitely an incredibly powerful and very well-respected mafioso. But germane to our conversation today is he lived in the Atlantic Highlands. So I'm going to pull up real quick here on my notes where he lived. In 1947, he bought a house for $38,000 at 130 Ocean Boulevard. He put in a bunch of improvements to that, and it became a place, I believe it had 7 beds, 6 bathrooms, and sold most recently for $1.4 million in 2014. He also bought some property nearby in Middletown and created kind of a park, and he had this mini Mount Vesuvius, which is still there as part of the park, and you can see that there. So he had a lot of influence around the area. His main operations were in New York City, but again, this became kind of like a bedroom community. This was his commute home whenever he would need to get away from all the hotbed of activity that was going on in New York at that time. So in 1953, he divorced his first wife and settled down with his maid, and he sold his house at Ocean Boulevard. He moved into a house at 68 West Highland Avenue, a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, that he lived from 1953 through 1960. But what happened after he divorced his wife is she took him to court for alimony, and throughout the divorce proceedings, kind of uncovered some of not only his illicit activities in terms of finances, but also it was revealed that his house in the Atlantic Highlands on Ocean Boulevard was a huge meeting place for a lot of mafioso, and it was a way for them to get, to meet without the prying eye of law enforcement, especially in New York City. So that house at 130 Ocean Boulevard was one of the big meeting places for higher level mafioso from the Genovese family in the 40s and 50s. And now, he lived at that house on Highland Avenue until 1960, and in 1960, what happened? Well, he changed his address then to Leavenworth Prison, where he was imprisoned on narcotics charges, and he eventually died in February of 1969. But that didn't end the Genovese family's operations in Monmouth County. And not only were the Genovese family out of New York active in Monmouth County, but there was also another crime family active in Monmouth County, the DeCavalcante family. And the DeCavalcante family is a homegrown New Jersey mafia family based out of Elizabeth, specifically the Peterstown area of Elizabeth, New Jersey. And the DeCavalcante family operated mostly in central Jersey, and yes, there is a central Jersey, but Monmouth County was one of their kind of really active areas. Again, gambling, loan sharking, extortion, drugs, prostitution, and a lot of labor infiltration. They were heavily involved in labor unions. So Monmouth County was really kind of that epicenter for them. And a couple other people that lived in the area, just 6 miles up the road from where Vito Genovese lived in the 1970s and early 80s in Kingsburg, was the house of the leader of a notorious group of Irish gangsters called the Westies. His name was Jimmy Coonan, and Kingsburg was his place of residence. And again, bedroom community. He kind of really put forth this thing of, a nice suburban dad, just kind of, like an everyday kind of 9-to-5 guy. And instead, he was head of one of the most notorious in terms of sheer violence of any organized crime group ever in the history of New York City. He eventually went to prison in the early 1980s. But so Monmouth County and the Atlantic Highlands area especially has a very long and storied history of organized crime. Now, germane to the movie that you're going to be seeing this evening, The Traitor, which is a true story of Tommaso Buscetta, who was one of the first major Sicilian mafioso to crack that code of omerta of silence and turn against his compatriots in the Sicilian mafia, is one of the things that he brought to light for U.S. investigators was the existence of a large-scale heroin smuggling operation in the United States called the Pizza Connection. And there were a string of pizzerias across New Jersey, I believe one of which was in Monmouth County, definitely one in Middlesex County, Cafe Roma in Menlo Park. But this Pizza Connection throughout New Jersey, New York, and out to Chicago served as a front for one of the largest heroin importation and trafficking rings in U.S. history. And it was all under the auspices of the Sicilian Mafia. And because of the courage of Tommaso Buscetta in terms of giving us information and putting not only his life on the line, but as you'll see in the movie, his family's life on the line, the police were able to crack that and put that operation out of business. So again, I'm sorry I can't be here this evening to answer questions or talk to you, but I hope you enjoyed the movie. Thank you again very much for having me come talk to you all tonight and enjoy it. And again, my name is Scott Deitche. ScottDeitche.com is my website if you want some information. Feel free to contact me, email me. The information's right there on the website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have after the fact. So everyone have a good evening.